All right, let's go ahead and wrap this up. We're in our last section of our lecture notes for chapter 7, the Islamic Empire. All right, so let's talk about slavery, right? So one thing, all right, so Islamic law says that uh, slaves cannot be Muslims, they cannot be Jews, they cannot be Christians. Even Zoroastrians are also banned from being enslaved. And of course, these were the rules, but doesn't mean that they're always, 100% enforced. So Muslims can't be enslaved by other Muslims, and Jews and Christians neither. So we see, so because of that restriction, the slave owners, right, in the Arab Empire, who are looking for a reliable, cheap labor force that they can, rip off and take advantage of, they're gonna have to go long distance, right? So they're gonna go to sub-Saharan Africa, right? And here we see a picture of these sub-Saharan Africans who, probably either have to sail across the Indian Ocean or travel across the Trans-Sahara Desert trade network in order to become, to reach the slave plantations in the Mediterranean. So slaves had to come from Africa. A lot of slaves came from Eastern Europe, right? So in previous chapter we talked about how the Kiev and Rus, how they would sell slaves to the Byzantines. Well, the Byzantines will sell those same exact slaves to the Muslims. And we also see slaves coming from Central Asia, right? And that's how the Mamluks, right, those Turkish people, first were brought into the Islamic Empire. They were brought in as slaves. So another thing we should know is that slaves who did convert were supposedly set free. Um, Slave women was also a very popular um, practice, slavery for women, and basically wealthy men who were able to afford having four wives, which was the maximum limit. They will be able to hire, be able to purchase female slaves, and they can use them as concubines, which is a fancy word for having a mistress. So if four women, four wives is not enough for you, then you have the option of purchasing slaves as an additional mistress. And one an odd thing is that the slave women tended to have more freedom than the wives of the slave owner, because these slave women, because they weren't Muslim and because they weren't upper class, they were able to, walk freely in the marketplace, go and run errands, not have to be covered, and so on and so forth. All right, let's talk about women next, and this is kind of like a controversial topic because there's a lot of issues even in modern times about Muslim women. But one thing we should know is that a lot of the restrictions about Muslim women were based on previous traditions, right? So the Muslims were not the first ones to come up with the idea of putting women under the veil, right? Um, that's something that originated in Mesopotamia, and the Persians adopted it, and then the Romans and the Greeks and the Byzantines, all of them adopted it. So women, especially upper class women, were expected to veil, right, to be covered. And even to this day, some countries are very lenient, other countries are very, very strict. Some, of what they wear is minimum, some is, extreme, meaning that their whole body, their whole face is company. But there's other restrictions as well besides veiling. Of course, they couldn't run for political office. They couldn't get educated unless they were with other women or they were being educated by a family relative. But they couldn't go like to a school and have a male teacher that they're not related to teach them and educate them. That was banned. So like I said, there's different headgears, right? Worn. The most common one's probably the hijab. But the more extreme ones would be the burqa, right, where you don't see anything, you barely see just the eyes. So it kind of varies from country to country. Uh, but this is probably the most common one in Islamic or Muslim societies, even to this day. The more extreme ones, right, we see these, in Saudi Arabia, in in uh, in Saudi Arabia and in Afghanistan and in Iran, right? Those are kind of like the more mandatory ones. All right. When it also comes to women, we see that women, generally speaking, had a higher status of than higher status than other women during this time. So when we get to China, we're going to see that Chinese women, it was a super patriarchal society. Europe was pretty much the same thing. So women in the Islamic world will have more rights. Of course, you're going to have restrictions, and they're never going to be equal, but they have more rights than the average woman elsewhere. And a lot of this stuff comes from Muhammad's personal life. So he kind of set the example of how to treat women, especially their wives. So one thing that became one of his rules was that women receive payment for marriage, right? So in the past, you had to pay a dowry, right? So if you're a husband, you're gonna get married, you have to pay money to the father of the bride, right? To your wife's father, your father-in-law, for the honor, for the right to marry her, and then the father kept that money. Well, Muhammad said, no, it shouldn't go to the father, it should go to the wife, and the wife gets to keep it as part of her personal property. On the off chance, that they get divorced, and she has that money to be able to be more independent, right? Also, another thing Muhammad says is no more female infanticide, which is going to see we're going to see this actually happen quite a lot in China, right? Where because of patriarchy, because of views that women were not as important and not as good as men, it becomes very common for newborn baby girls to be killed, right? Infanticide is killing of infants, and women, female infants, were killed all the time. So Muhammad said, you can't do that anymore. Also, Muhammad's personal relations kind of set the examples of what makes a proper Muslim woman and what makes an improper woman. The positive example is his first wife, Khadijah. She was an older woman than he was, and she was wealthy. She was educated, and she's considered the first Muslim, the first one to believe in Muhammad's revelations. So she was always this like faithful, following, submissive wife, always doing what her husband asked, but sharing a lot in the marriage, right? Having almost equal status with him. In fact, she was his boss. So she's supposed to be like the good wife, right? Later on, as Muhammad started getting other wives, he gets a one of his wives called Aisha, and Aisha was only 12 years old. Right? Child marriage, by the way, was absolutely common pretty much everywhere around the world during this time, until very recently, and even in some countries, 12-year-olds and younger getting married, which is absolutely crazy. But the point is, Aisha, because she was young, and she's married some guy that's like, 55 years old, she tended to be more rebellious and, not listen to the husband and blah, blah, blah. And she even thought, women should have a role in the new empire that's about to be, created. Her father was Abu Bakr, right, who's the first caliph. So she's viewed as kind of like the bad wife, right? Like the bad example. Because, how dare a woman try to have political aspirations? How dare a woman rebel or be disloyal to her husband, right? And it wasn't like she cheated on him or anything like that. It just was that she didn't get along with him because, they're 40 years apart. Um, what else? What else? What else? What else? So, like I mentioned already, Muslim women had higher status than most of their contemporaries. They had all these different rights, like birth control and testifying in court, even though the testimony of a woman only counted half as much as the testimony of a man. So, if a woman goes to court and says, "I saw this person commit this crime," and a guy comes and says, "I saw that another person committed the crime," then the testimony of the guy will be considered more valuable. Um, so they could remarry, they could inherit property, they could own property. So even though they had been isolated and been veiled, generally speaking, Muslim women had more rights. One thing that we see starts happening, especially of course amongst the upper class, is the practicing of living in harems. Right, and here we see a picture of that. Basically, there will be kind of like this designated area of a house or a palace where only women and children are allowed to stay. Right, men are kind of like forbidden. And so if I'm like a governor, I'm this upper class merchant guy, and I have my four wives and I have all these kids, so I'm gonna throw them all in the same room, in the harem, and that's where they stay. So there's no males around that might negative influence them. And I know that when I'm off to work, and I go to the office to to go do my job, that my wife and my kids are going to be safe and they're not going to be negatively influenced by any unwanted men, because they are going to be secluded. They're going to be isolated in this harem. So the idea was that it's protecting the children, protecting the wives, but in reality, it was just this kind of way to keep the wives out of the public eye, right, out of the social view, and they're just kind of isolated at home. And you can imagine that all these different wives, that all are competing against each other because they all want their children to inherit the most amount of property from their father. And we see that especially in the royal families, that the harems would be like these scenes of like horrific crimes, or the royal family will start poisoning each other, killing each other, backstabbing each other, all in an attempt again to gain that highest status as the number one heir to the throne or heir to the title. All right, what else? All right, so spread of Islam. So we see that the Muslim religion spreads, right? Islam spreads. At first, it spreads through violence, essentially, right? Abu Bakr and the caliphs, right? The Umayyads, the Abbasids, they conquer all these territories, right? Middle East, North Africa, Spain, huge empire. And even though the people are not forced to convert, many of them do, right? Because they believe that if they become Muslims and they have political equality, they have economic opportunities, so they're going to convert. Plus, if you convert, you don't have to pay any special taxes. You have to pay the Jizat tax. So by conquest is kind of the first way, right? We also see that Europe, Islam even reaches Europe, right? Spain is of course, the main place where it reaches, but thanks to a famous guy called Charles the Hammer Martel, he's a French king, a Frankish king. He stops the invasions at the Battle of Tours, and in doing so, he stops Islam from spreading into other parts of Western Europe. The Byzantines in Eastern Europe are the ones who are able to stop the Islamic expansion there for a very long time. But so the first way it expands is through violence, through conquest. The second way it expands is through trade, right? And we saw how Christianity and Buddhism back in time period two in the classical era, they had spread the same way. Islam does it now here in Unit 3, in time period 3, in the post classical era. So we see Islam spread throughout Central Asia, along the Silk Road. We see it spreads into West Africa along the Trans-Saharan Trade Network. It spreads into East Africa, it spreads into India, it spreads into Southeast Asia, thanks to the Indian Ocean Trade Network. So wherever merchants went, Islam followed, and all these different little kingdoms and territories and city-states, and they're all going to start converting to Islam because they realize that they are closer they are to this huge, massive, super powerful Islamic empire, that the more political ties they have, the better economic opportunities they will have as well. Now, another way that we see Islam spread is through education, right? So we know that the Islamic Empire had these major cities like Cordoba and Baghdad and Cairo, centers of education and higher learning. But we also see the construction, the building of madrasas. All right, so madrasas are basically like religious schools. So they teach you how to read and write because they want you to read and write, about the Quran and in Arabic, so they kind of become like elementary schools, middle schools, that sort of stuff. And so there were religious teachings that are going on there, and we still see madrasas around the world even to this day. So the madrasas kind of fulfill this need for educating people in the religion, because under Islam there is no priest. There is no priest who tells you what to believe in, like you might have in Christianity. Um, or like a monk, like in Buddhism. So in Islam, they don't have a priest. So how do you learn about the religion? Well, you get educated, you read the Quran, and you figure things out for yourself. So who's paying for all of this? Well, the rich people are, because they're going to be funding the construction of these schools, these madrasas. They're going to be funding they're going to be sending their kids there to get educated. And so why are you going to spend so much money? Why donate money to madrasas? Why invest money in these schools? Well, because if you're a rich, wealthy merchant, remember one of the five pillars is charity, right? You have to give alms. So what better way than building a school and funding it? So madrasas, they have a lot of popular support, and again, many of them exist to this day. And universities all over the Arab Empire, they kind of like grow out of these madrasas. All right, so we see these huge, huge, huge buildings. These are, schools basically, and some, of course, much more fancy than others. But they're learning, right? They're learning to read, write, they're learning math, they're learning science, and they're learning, of course, their religion. All right, so Islamic culture diffuses throughout Afro-Eurasia. That's kind of your main idea. And we're going to see that this similar thing is going to happen with Buddhism, right? Especially throughout Eastern Asia. All right, last and final thing are the Sufis. Whew, we're almost done. Stay with me. Here we go. All right, so the Sufis. Sufis are a special group. They're Persian of Muslims, right? So they're Muslims, but they practice religion a little bit different than other Muslims. And the Sufis believe that, it's not about studying the Quran and knowing all the verses and knowing all the lines in the book. That's not really the best way to connect to God. They feel that there has to be a more intimate, more personal connection between the individual and the supreme and the divine. So they start saying, you could pray and you can meditate. There's no need to study because we all can connect with God because God is within us, right? We all have that inner part that is God. So they would, sing, they would dance, they'll spin in circles, and they'll stay up like super late at night and not go to sleep because they feel that by kind of like pushing their bodies in these physical activities, it's kind of like heightening their spiritual awakening, spiritual awareness, and they're able to connect with God. So Sufis also are kind of like monks. I remember the monks are kind of like isolating themselves from society. They want to kind of just live in peace and quiet and just meditate and pray all day. Right? Christians did this, the Buddhists did this, and the Sufis would do this as well within Islam. So they kind of just want to focus on their connection with God. That's like kind of their main thing. And one last thing we need to mention about the Sufis is that they're going to be pretty open-minded. um, Wherever they go, they're going to start, preaching, and they're going to become missionaries, and they're going to help spread Islam. But because they're more open-minded, they feel that there's different kind of like paths to God. There's different ways to reach God. So they're not going to say, "Oh, look, if now that we're Muslims, you have to do it this way." All right, so when they go into India, they're going to tell the Hindus, look, you pray to all these different gods, but all these different gods are just really just one God, right? You call him Brahma, we call him Allah, but it's the same exact God, right? So a lot of Hindus start kind of like connecting their religion with this new religion of Islam, right? They're going to do the same thing in Persia with Zoroastrianism. They're going to do the same thing in Africa, right, with the traditional religions there, right? And the Africans are going to slowly start saying, we believe in one God. We call them, X, Y, and Z, but now we're going to call him Allah, right? We believe in ancestral spirits. Well, maybe it's not really ancestral spirits anymore. Um, Maybe it's angels or whatever, out there in the spiritual world that can protect us. So the because the Sufis are more open-minded, they're going to be able to convince people, convert people to Islam, right? By kind of like blending and synchronizing and mixing and matching different religious traditions to make Islam more and more popular, right? They help popularize the religion, right? So they're going to start here in the Middle East, they're going to start here in Persia, they're going to go into India, they're going to go into Southeast Asia, they're going to go into Africa, right? And wherever they go, they will also bring Islam with them. All right, that's it. I hope you're not staying up super late watching this, like I'm staying up super late creating this. See you tomorrow when you turn in your homework.